This is the first Sabbath of a new year. And some people say it's a new decade. But for the nerds in the crowd, you do realize the real decade begins next year. Just saying. Do you guys remember Y2K? Do you realize that was 20 years ago? Remember how crazy we went? The computers would crash, the economy wouldn't work anymore. It all came and went, and we're just fine. Now, I'm talking about 20 years ago. Some of you can barely remember 10 years ago, right? Every new year, we come to a new place and we make new decisions. I mean, this last year, you probably had a lot of victories, a lot of challenges, a lot of gains, a lot of losses. In our church, we've had the same. We've lost quite a few of our members. Some people got engaged, some got married, some had new kids. The story of our lives continues. The story of God's kingdom continues. For the year 2020, the pastoral staff at Miami Temple decided to take a fresh look at God's story. So throughout this year, we are going to talk about God's story. And this month is about God's story with the family. God's story, God's dreams for the family. And we thought there was no better subject, no better person to talk about God's story than the greatest dreamer of all, Joseph. Joseph was a dreamer. And this month we're going to talk about him. God's dream for the family. I don't have any slides today because actually this is on the fritz. The slide is on the fritz. If I put them on, they'll go off. So there are no slides today, but you will be able to go and review the sermon as usual online. The title of my sermon today is Joseph, God's Gift of Grace. There's a vibrant small group that meets at my house every Friday night at 7:30. Well, between 7 and 7:30. They are loud. They are boisterous. And they eat my food. Last night, we had Haitian soup, pumpkin soup. And man, did they drink that soup. And it's amazing that in this group, we look forward to it every week, every Friday night, because there's laughter. Right now, we're going through a book written by two Christian psychologists called How We Love. The premise of the book is very, very simple. The book talks about the imprint of intimacy, which is the sum of our learning how to love. Let me read with you what the authors call imprinting. Quote, a remarkable phenomenon that occurs in animals and theoretically in humans in the first hours of life is imprinting. The newborn creature bonds to the type of animals it meets at birth and begins to pattern its behavior after them. In other words, if you take the egg of an eagle and place it in the nurse of a turkey, when that baby eagle is born and looks at mama turkey, that eagle is no longer an eagle. That little eaglet will function as a turkey for the rest of its life, even though it has the power of an eagle. We call that imprinting. In humans, this is often called bonding, and is usually refers to the relationship between the newborn and its parents. You will notice when a baby is being fed or nursing, they look at their mom. And that face is imprinted in their memory, in their mind, in their brain. And as they grow as a little human, every action that happens is an imprint of how the child will be. So, according to this theory, the way we love has been impacted by the way we're imprinted by our family of origin, the way we grew up. The way you love, the way you express love or lack thereof, has a lot to do with the way you were loved, the way you saw love happen. The way we do family has a lot to do with the way you were imprinted in your family from the age of 1 through 7. We typically reproduce what we saw and what we experienced in our family lives as children. So let's apply this to Joseph and his family. All of you, you know the story very well. You've heard about Joseph since you were a child in church. Well, let's take a closer look at Joseph's imprint. To do that, you have to go back to his great-grandfather Abraham. What was Abraham's imprint? Well, Abraham, as you know, became the first Jew. But before he was the first Jew, he had a different imprint. You see, Abraham's father was a man whose name was Terah. Terah was an idol worshiper. Not only did Terah worship idols, he was a priest of idol worshipers. Not only that, his profession, beside being a priest, he made idols out of wood, and he would send his son Abraham and the two brothers to sell them in the market. That's how the family made their money. So Abraham's life, before he was called by God, he was imprinted as an idol worshiper. That's Joseph's great-grandfather. Let's talk about Joseph's grandfather, who was Isaac. He was the son of promise. But remember what happened when Isaac came along. He was born in a home filled with contention. He saw his mother fight constantly with his brother's mother, and his father was right in the middle. And there's not much Isaac could have done except watch the volleyball between Sarah and Ishmael's mother. And part of Isaac's imprinting is that he woke up one day and his older brother, his playmate, was gone. Do you think that had an imprint on Isaac and who he was? Let's go one step further. I know when we read the Bible, we see how God guides his people, but we forget about the human factor. Can you imagine the trauma Isaac went through when he was laid on that piece of wood and his father was about to plunge knife in his chest? Yes, God guided them, but what about the human Isaac? I believe that traumatized him for the rest of his life. And that created some type of emotional imprint in Isaac. That was Joseph's grandfather. Now we come to Joseph's father, Jacob. Boy, is he a mess. He's a liar. He's a swindler. He will do anything to get what he wants, including stealing his brother's birthright. You know the story of Jacob. And Jacob's home was a mess. You had violence, you had incest, you had multiple murders. You had one son taking over his father's wife. Can you imagine little Joseph growing in that environment? What kind of imprint do you think Jacob gave to his son Joseph because of who he was? Jacob was a lousy husband. He was a lousy father. You know why? He had some very, very solid negative imprint from generations. For one thing, he didn't like his wife. He didn't love his wife, at least the first one. The one he really loved, he had to labor for. He was cheated. Do you think that had an impact on who he was as a man? And finally, when he marries his love, she dies in childbirth. So what does he do? he favors the oldest. Now, Joseph is around. So Jacob wastes no time in making sure that everyone knew that Joseph was his favorite. Before I go any further, I want to submit to you two ideas. Idea number one: every person I've mentioned so far, from Abraham to Joseph, had been negatively imprinted as humans. But they were called by God, and God gave them a new imprint, what I call the gift of grace. The gift of grace is imprinted in you the moment you accept Jesus as your personal Savior. The imprint of grace. Because you look at Abraham, an idol worshiper, that was his human imprint. But God called him, made him the father of a great nation, made him the first Jew, and imprinted him with the gift of grace. But folks, you need to remember, in spite of God's imprint, the human element is still there. That's what Ellen White calls the great controversy, the fight between the flesh and the divine, the fight between the devil and Jesus. It is constant. But do not forget the imprint of grace. The second thing I want to share with you is Joseph was a gift of grace to Jacob. When you consider the family line I just described to you, he was a gift of grace. And third, I want to suggest that all the things, the bad things that happened in Joseph's life was because of Jacob. Jacob set his son up for all the misery that he suffered. That was part of the human imprint that God had to litigate against. Now let's take a closer look at Joseph's imprint. Number one, I already told you, he was the favorite son from the favorite wife. That's an imprint. Two, he grew up in a home filled with anger, jealousy, deceit that was passed from generation to generation. Abraham lied, remember? Who else lied? Isaac lied. Jacob lied. They were a generation of liars. They did whatever they needed to do to get what they wanted. They said whatever they needed to say to get what they wanted. And most of the time, it was not true. That was a natural human imprint. Three, examine for a moment. The expensive ornamental robe that Jacob gave to Joseph made a statement. You see, in those days, people wore clothes so they could work the ground. It was an agrarian society. They lived from the earth. They worked. So if you're a hard worker, you barely wore any clothes. Joseph's robe went to here. It was a long robe, flowing. He couldn't work. So when the father gave him that expensive robe, the statement was, hey, Joseph, you don't have to work like your brothers. You're special. Joseph knew it, and the brothers knew it. Do you think that imprinted Joseph? Yes, it did. Fourth imprint on Joseph. Joseph was an unwise and immature dreamer. You can get a gift from God, but sometimes you don't always use it wisely. And five, the reality is, in spite of it all, Joseph was a gift of grace to a very dysfunctional family. One last thing I want to make clear. God's story of family begins with an imprint of love. Okay? When God created Adam and Eve, he imprinted them with his love. When Adam gave over the kingdom of earth to the evil one, he received an imprint of sin. In the story of salvation, God's story is the story of God reversing the imprint of sin and returning us to an imprint of grace. Throughout the Bible, God has dealt with men and women with imprints of sin. And He's constantly hounding us to bring out our imprint of grace. It was a great French theologian, Blaise Pascal, who said, there's a God-shaped hole in the life of every human. There's a God-shaped hole in the life of every human. Even though we're all dysfunctional because of sin, everyone and every family need to find their gift of grace in the midst of the dysfunction. Let me repeat that. Even though we are all dysfunctional, one of the greatest psychologists I've read from says 97% of humanity is dysfunctional. And he continued by saying, I'm yet to find any one of the 3 percentile. So the minute you're born, you are imprinted with dysfunction, some worse than others, some different from others, but you are a dysfunctional human being. And Joseph's story wants to teach us, you still have imprints of grace in you. You still have imprints of grace in your family. You need to find it. You need to find them. A potentially healthy family must find their gifts of grace. In order to do that, you need to explore your generational imprinting and how it has affected you socially, emotionally, and spiritually. Let me give you an example. I'm going to be vulnerable for a moment. I'm going to use myself as an example. I wrote it down so I don't go off the boundaries. I'm the eldest of 5. My parents were strict Caribbean conservative SDAs from the 50s. You're already making pictures in your mind, right? As you know, being the oldest child has its own psychosis. You know that, right? As an older child, I was my parents' first experiment in parenting. Older children, you know what I'm talking about. Meaning, all the rules, those conservative rules, were applied to me without exception. Then there was the pressure of me being the older brother, and all my little siblings had to look up to me. Only for me to watch them break those rules close to murder, and they got away with it. I didn't. I'm talking to you about my imprinting. It doesn't stop there. It so happened that I was like my father. We had some things in common. So you know what happens, right? Kids tend to clash with the parent they are more like. You know what I'm saying? So my father and I were alike. So we clashed. I became the proverbial difficult firstborn. So I was kept on a short leash. But those of you who know me, you know I cannot stay on a short leash. So eventually I became of age. My first step into freedom landed myself in a Seventh-day Adventist Caribbean college. So after all these years of strict, conservative, self-righteous STL upbringing, I ended up in the same environment in college, which was supposed to be my freedom. Now, by the time I leave college, I get married, I have a family. What kind of family leader do you think I am? Are you following me? Imprinting. That imprint imprint from the family into society, in the home, where you went to college, who your friends were. All of that makes you who you are. And by the time you fall in love and you say, I do, you form a family, you're messed up. And your poor kids. And then you wonder, why are they like that? They're like you. My kids are like me. Sometimes I have some serious talk with my son. And he actually talks to me still. And when I see myself in him, I said, oh my God, help him out. Don't you, those of you who are parents, don't you see that sometime in your kids? You talk to them and you see yourself, the path you followed, and you wish they could see what you see now. But they have to go through the imprinting. And you have to pray for them that God's imprinting of grace comes out sooner than later. Sometimes as parents, we react harshly to our children. We say awful things to them. We give awful examples. It's all part of the imprint. And you can have all the psychology, all the counseling, all the praying in the world, but until you submit to God, your story, your imprinting, your background, it's not going to change. You don't have to be a great psychotherapist to decide that when you have negative imprinting, it's very difficult to be a good person. Can you imagine that there are people who are not very nice and they're not even aware of it? Let me repeat that. Can you imagine there are people around in this church, they're not very nice people. They're not aware of it. You see it, I see it. Sometimes I say dumb things. I'm not even aware of it. Where's that coming from? Imprinting. The stuff I heard along the way, the stuff I heard along the path, the friends I made, the connections I made that were not so positive. Life has imprinted me into who I am today, into who you are today. And sometimes we are not aware of it. So when we get ready to get married, we meet someone who looks nice, who sounds nice, who acts nice. So we marry them to create a nice family. And then we find out who they really are. Then the imprint comes out. You go, oh my gosh, what was I thinking? But it's too late. Imprinting. You see, we wouldn't be here today if it were not for God's gift of grace. It's like buying a shiny car, but you have no idea what's under the hood. That's how families begin. There's a direct correlation between the divorce rate and our lack of knowledge of each other. To become healthier individuals and couples, we must acknowledge where we came from and why we are the way we are. And it's never too late. So, let's break this down for the family using Joseph's background. Let me zoom on 3 specific imprints. And I'm hoping through these imprints, you will learn some lessons from the life of Joseph and the story of his dream. First, earlier I referred to what I call generational imprints. Listen, humanly speaking, you cannot fight heredity. The genes you got. They're not going anywhere. And then you pass them on to your kids. That's generational heredity. Jacob was a liar like his dad and granddad. Jacob's boys inherited a mess. However, even though you cannot fight heredity, you can take one important step. Like I said earlier, you need to find out your background. For example, let me give you an example of myself. I am stubborn like my dad. But check this out. I love knowledge and books like my paternal great-grandfather. How do I know that? I did the research. I can love deeply like my mother and yet can be fiercely combatant like my maternal grandfather. How do I know? I did the research. With that knowledge, I know what I'm working with. You get me? And when I need help, when I go to counseling, I know what to ask for. Have you ever woken up one morning and said to yourself, man, I'm messed up? If you've never done that, hello. It's true. Some mornings I wake up, I go, man, I am messed up. But here's the deal. But you got to know how you got messed up. And when you find out, then you need to get some help. I'm close to perfect today because I got help. I'm just being Jacob, okay? I'm lying. It's not true. But I did get help. And when I went for help, I decided, hey, this is my issue. This is this. Help me with that. That's the first step in fighting generational imprinting. Because the genes are there. So step one. Step two, when you find out what your issue is, you bring them to the throne of grace. And folks, I know I'm going to get stones thrown at me. Don't always expect a miracle. Meaning, God's going to snap and suddenly you're going to be a different person. No, that's not going to happen. You still have the genes in your body. You still have a body of sin. It takes time. Ellen White says transformation is a work of a lifetime. So, two things I've said. Do your research. Find out why you're messed up, where it came from. Make a list. Get help. Then submit that list to God. Now, I know some people tell me, all I need to do is pray. So, if you're having a heart attack, what you going to do? Pray? You will die. So, if you're messed up generationally, praying is good. But God has put professionals around to help you. Get help. Number two, not only we have generational imprint, we also have what I call relational and emotional imprint. Ever since the evil one imprinted with humanity, with sin, men, as in male, now I'm talking to you men, and men don't throw tomatoes at me, I'm just speaking the word. When you look at the closer history of men, M-E-N, males in society from the beginning, the male species tend to be detached emotionally. That's because of the imprint of sin. Just like Adam, first thing Adam did was to hide from God. He disconnected from God emotionally right after sin. Every man after Adam has been doing the same thing ever since. Fathers, this is for you. Get the story of your family and tell your boys, tell your girls. If you go to any ancient culture, even biblical culture, stories were passed on from fathers to their children. That's how we got the Bible, by the way. Word of mouth. We stopped. And ever since we stopped, the distance between men and their sons, men and their daughters, men and their wives have been widening. Let's go back to telling the story. Tell your story. If you do not have any sons or any children, men, find a young man for you men to talk to coach. And when they are ready, tell them your story. The good part, the part that's not so good. that will help you connect emotionally. And we've discovered that boys who grew up in families where their fathers tell them the story, they become better husbands, better members of society. Young girls whose father have told them the story of their family have less issues with low self-esteem. They make better wives. They are more secure women. The opposite is also true. So men, find your story. Do some stuff so you can learn to relate emotionally to your wives, to your children. We've missed doing that as men because of the imprint of sin. The last imprint I want to talk to you about as I conclude is the spiritual imprint. If you read your Bible close enough, you'll notice that very few of the patriarchs were initially close to God. Check it out. God had to hunt them down, all of them. Joseph is one of the few patriarchs who had an inclination toward God. There are few. Joseph was one of them. This is why we picked him to tell you the story of grace this month in January. Because you see, Joseph is the ultimate gift of grace. Even though there was all kind of drama in Jacob's home, like I said earlier, multiple murders, rape, incest, lies, deceptions over and over again, yet Joseph came out as the gift of grace. You see, all those patriarchs, a lot of them, they had rituals. Jacob had rituals. But it was near the end, as he got older, that he actually had a relationship with God. There's a direct correlation between what happened in the Old Testament and what happens in the Christian church today. I have a lot of friends who are pastors. And you wouldn't believe the kind of talks we have on the phone because they know I've been a pastor. I'm a counselor now. I speak. They call me. And when you hear the story of these men and some women, what they're going through because they have no friends. Do you realize that? A pastor cannot have friends in the church. What if they have to discipline you a year later and you're their friend? You know what I'm saying? These men are lonely. They are disconnected emotionally. And the poor wife have to bear so many burdens of theirs that, some of them don't talk at all. They keep it all in. And they find themselves lost in a spiritual forest. And they have to get up on Sabbath morning and preach. Imprinting. Spiritual imprinting. You have to nurture a relationship with God. Oops. Okay. The 10 bad boys of Jacob were a reflection of their father and the generations before them. So my question to you, what's your imprint? Who are you? What's your generation? 5 minutes and I'm done. I want to conclude with this. Watch for your gift of grace. Joseph was a gift of grace to Jacob and the family. You wonder, how can such a kid out of such a family turn out to be such a great leader? It was a gift of grace from God. Notice what he said in Genesis 50 verse 20. His father just died. His brothers are afraid that there's payback coming. So they come to Joseph and said, hey, we didn't mean to hurt you. We're talking about something that happened 30 years before. And this is what Joseph said. Genesis 50:20. You intended to harm me, but God intended all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. In other words, Joseph was saying, I am the gift of grace. Do you realize that Joseph was a type of Christ? The story of Joseph mirror the life of Christ in so many ways. So I suggest you look within yourself. Look within your family. Find the gifts of grace. I guarantee you it's there. You must look for it. You must find it. Every family, every individual, every generations have gifts of grace. Things that you do well, find them, build on them. Those gifts of grace, if watered, will grow and take you to places you never imagined. Unfortunately, we tend to look at all the negative, the drama in our families. We tend to look at the devil's imprint instead of God's imprint of grace. If you look closely at God's story, at any time, again I say, you will find gifts of grace. No matter how bad you think you are, no matter how bad your family heritage might seem to be, God has sprinkled gifts of grace. And after today's sermon, my hope is you'll go, you'll hunt them, you'll find them in your family heritage. And when you pray, you will remember that you too are a gift of grace. Amen.